As a forensic expert, have you ever encountered a case that left people choked with emotion? A young girl dies from rape. Her corpse, terrifying to behold. During the autopsy, it was discovered that there was also a dead fetus in her womb. But the most heartbreaking thing was not the loss of two lives in one body, but rather the horrifying secret found on her body. The story is based on a true case, with character names and case details modified. Putting on a pair of size 7x5 surgical gloves, I looked down at the scar on my left hand to calm myself. My mentor had repeatedly advised me to wear an extra layer of gloves when performing autopsies. When you handle scalpels often, it's hard to avoid cutting yourself. Familiar images from the past flashed through my mind, each scar representing a memory. I knew I had to put my personal feelings aside while working, though it was difficult to do so. Once you put the gloves on, you have to enter battle mode. The autopsy room was in the basement of the hospital. It was extremely quiet in the room, with only the hum of the exhaust fan running. On the autopsy table lay a young girl, her long eyelashes slightly curled, as if she were merely asleep. Just a day before, her life had not yet been taken. A slightly yellowish light from the surgical lamp shone on the cold body lying in the middle of the autopsy table. Against the wall was a row of cabinets for surgical instruments, and in the corner were several red plastic containers holding organs. On the afternoon of May 7th, the body of the young girl was discovered by children playing soccer in the park. Under the dappled shade of the trees, that was the first time I saw her. At that time, her body had been discarded next to a large tree, and at first glance, she looked like just another passerby resting under the tree. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, mixed with the faint smell of decay. I placed the surgical instrument case aside and squatted down. Her dark red hair spread across the grass, the curls tangled with weeds, and a black hair tie lay in the grass 1/2 meter away. The ground beneath her feet bore 2 deep grooves, and weeds and leaves were gathered into a small pile, evidence of her struggle. More striking were the 2 dark red oval wounds on her upper torso, while her abdomen was slashed open on both sides, intestines protruding and spilling out of the greater omentum. From the smell, I guessed that her intestines had probably been completely torn. At first glance, this appeared to be a case of rape and murder, with no signs of intense struggle. It could have been committed by someone she knew, or perhaps the difference in strength was simply too great. However, there were no identifying items around, such as an ID card, phone, keys, or wallet, to confirm the victim's identity. "Just take the body back first," I said, taking off my gloves and standing up. The forest had grown incredibly dark, with only a few birds flying back and forth. In the autopsy room, my assistant helped me remove the clothing from the body, conducting an examination and taking photos. Height, 165 centimeters. Extremely beautiful appearance, fair skin, well-proportioned body. Large purple post-mortem lividity patches had appeared on her back, indicating that she had remained in a supine position after death. I pressed my finger down, and the lividity lightened slightly, a typical sign of the exudative phase. Exudative phase, partial fixation of post-mortem lividity, begins 12 hours after death, sometimes earlier, 8 to 10 hours. During this time, red blood cells and plasma leak into the surrounding tissues, and surrounding fluids are absorbed into the vessels, leading to the fixation of lividity, making secondary lividity less likely when changing body position. The finger press sign is also not very distinct, with lividity only lightening slightly. If incised, blood would drip only slowly. The assistant parted the mouth and limbs of the body, beginning to take notes. Rigor mortis is pronounced in all the joints. I used my hand to open the eyelids, revealing cloudy, semi-transparent corneas and visibly contracted pupils. Rigor mortis, Latin rigor mortis, is a stage after death when joints become stiff and difficult to move due to partial muscle contraction. I made a quick mental calculation. Time of death was around 20 hours ago. Looking up at the wall clock, it was now 7:08 p.m. She had likely died around 11 p.m. the previous night. Her fingernails and lips were purple, with subconjunctival hemorrhage and other signs of asphyxiation. There was a bite mark on her lips and sharp puncture wounds on her chest and abdomen. I cut her nails to collect evidence, preparing for a day analysis. If I was not mistaken, she had scratched her attacker before she died. As a forensic pathologist, I also had the specialty of cutting hair. With my skills, I couldn't run a barber shop. I only knew how to shave heads bald. After shaving her head, I was able to examine the wound on her head. The occipital area showed swelling from internal bleeding, indicating that she had clearly been struck on the back of the head by the assailant. I collected vaginal swabs, and her genital area also had a piece cut off. The perpetrator was unimaginably depraved. To measure the length of the stab wound, I placed the dislodged intestines back into the abdominal cavity and brought both sides together. A 15-centimeter long wound appeared before my eyes. My assistant stood to the left of the body, mimicking the motion of stabbing down and pulling back, as if slashing horizontally. It seems the perpetrator held a sharp knife, stabbing down into the victim's right abdomen, and then slashing horizontally. Standing in this position, it would have taken considerable effort, perhaps enough to require using both hands to hold the knife, the assistant said. After finishing the examination, my assistant and I began stitching the body back together. My assistant was a young woman. As she stitched, she muttered to herself, "The stitches have to be delicate to match such a beautiful girl." But no matter how well we stitched her, we could never make up for the abuse she had suffered in life, or even after death. 10 p.m. Cigarette smoke filled the cramped meeting room, packed with people. I began presenting the findings of the autopsy and the crime scene to everyone. The technical and investigative teams held a briefing, focusing solely on the victim's identity, time of death, cause of death, the course of events, and motive. Forensic pathologists are the voice for the dead. Not only must we determine the cause and manner of death, but we must also do our best to infer the weapon used, sketch the suspect, and even recreate the crime scene. The responsibility weighed heavily on the shoulders of the forensic pathologist. Every word I spoke was written down by my colleagues. Making a mistake meant more than just losing face. It could mean losing your livelihood. The victim had 5 broken ribs and 4 blunt force injuries, all sustained while she was still alive. The 2 sharp force injuries had occurred when she was close to death, or possibly after she had already died. I had yet to determine why the perpetrator had chosen to mutilate the body. My guess was that the assailant had a twisted obsession with female genitalia, a perverse mind. Even though we had not yet received the complete autopsy results, I could already create a preliminary profile of the perpetrator. 1 or 2 young men carrying a sharp weapon, physically strong, capable of overpowering the victim from the front. During the autopsy, I discovered that the young girl was carrying a fetus in her womb. This was a case of 2 lives lost in one body. After I presented this finding, the meeting room erupted. Unexpectedly, just the previous night, we were still speculating about the victim's identity. But by the next morning, the case had a new breakthrough. The criminal investigation team consisted of over 30 people, responsible for more than 1,000 criminal cases annually for the entire district, so being short-staffed was a common occurrence. As a result, I had to take on additional duties, such as entering data into the unidentified bodies system and the victims of abuse and missing persons system. At 9 a.m. on May 8th, we received a missing person report from an elderly couple. The couple, both around 50 years old, were middle school teachers. They were modestly dressed, but exuded an air of education. They sat upright on the sofa, very polite, but their faces betrayed their anxiety, and their thick glasses couldn't hide their exhaustion. Their daughter, Jessica, had gone missing. On the evening of May 6th, their daughter went out and didn't return that night. Initially, they hadn't paid much attention. Their daughter was 26 years old, an elementary school teacher, engaged to her fiancé, and their new home was being renovated. By May 7th, which was her mother's birthday, Jessica still hadn't come home, and her phone was turned off. After calling her fiancé, Kevin, he said that 2 days ago he had received a call from Jessica, saying she was going out to dinner with friends that evening, and after that, he had not heard from her again. The elderly couple took out a photo from their bag. In the photo was a young woman with large eyes, an oval face, wearing a white dress, leaning against a cherry blossom tree. I was stunned, not knowing how to comfort the couple. I could only speak the truth. We have discovered a female body, but the identity hasn't been confirmed yet. I suggested they go to the autopsy room for identification. The elderly couple was calmer than I had imagined. They didn't cry out in anguish or faint. Instead, they became extremely silent. I could sense that they were trying to console themselves. It took several questions before I finally got a response. When I took their blood for testing, their eyes were fixed on the window. Even when the needle pierced their fingers and fresh blood flowed out, they only trembled slightly. The results came in at 3 p.m. that day. The deceased was indeed Jessica. Friday, before the incident, was supposed to be the day Jessica and Kevin registered their marriage. However, something urgent came up at Kevin's workplace, so they had to postpone it for a few days. But no one could have imagined that Jessica would never get the chance to register her marriage. 3. In Jessica's vaginal cavity, they found DNA belonging to a man, confirming evidence of sexual assault. Under her fingernails, DNA of another man was found. Moreover, neither of these DNA samples matched any records in the DNA database, meaning the suspects had no criminal record. I immediately reported the findings to the investigation unit. Meanwhile, the special task team discovered a new lead. On the night of May 7th, when Jessica died, a couple walking in the park had been robbed. The culprits were 3 young men with a local accent, wielding shiny daggers. The couple was smart. They threw their bag down and ran away, and the robbers didn't give chase. That night, after stealing the bag, the 3 punks kept wandering in the park and were caught by patrolling police. Late at night, the interrogation room on the first floor was still lit. I walked into the nearest room. A colleague pounded the table and gave me a knowing wink. "We've got evidence. Now it's up to him." I turned and walked out. "I'm going to get a lancet." A needle pierced down, and blood welled up from the fingertip of the blondie sitting in the interrogation chair. I pressed a cotton swab soaked in antiseptic on the wound, and he clenched his teeth in pain. "Your accomplices have already confessed. What are you going to do?" The blondie confessed to over 10 incidents of bag snatching. We spent the whole night questioning them, but the 3 kids never mentioned anything about rape or murder. There was still another lead. On the night of the incident, Jessica had contacted 3 people, her mother, Kevin, and her classmate, Diego. The task force called Diego, but the phone on the other end only rang a few times before being disconnected. Diego was a project engineer at a large company, a classmate of Jessica, and a childhood friend of Kevin. The police went to Diego's company to investigate. He was on the list of highly valued employees at the company, and in 2 months he was set to marry the daughter of the vice president of the company. However, Diego had not shown up for work for the past 2 days. Diego seemed to have it all, both love and career, leaving no apparent motive for rape or murder. Yet, he disappeared at the most critical moment and wasn't answering calls. That night, we went to Diego's company and collected fingerprints and DNA samples from his desk for testing. At 9 p.m. on May 9th, I received a call from the city's DNA testing lab. The 3 young robbers were not involved in the case. The semen found in Jessica's vaginal cavity belonged to Diego. The truth of the case was slowly revealing itself. Everyone who had been in contact with the victim was a suspect, and the lead involving Diego had to be pursued further. We speculated that Diego was one of the prime suspects and very likely the mastermind. 4. Diego seemed to have disappeared from the face of the earth, completely cutting off all social ties. His phone was turned off, and no one could reach him. The task force was deployed at every station, airport, and searched all possible hiding places he might use. Due to the shortage of police personnel, our technical department was also arranged to join the investigation squad. My colleague and I went to Diego's new house to speak with his fiancée and gather information. At first glance, Diego's fiancée bore some resemblance to Jessica, just with smaller eyes and a tall, slender frame. After showing our badges, we were invited inside. The new house was spacious and stylishly decorated, probably around 180 square meters. A wedding photo was placed on the TV stand in the living room, and red Chinese-style double happiness symbols and cross-stitch decorations were hanging on the wall.